just how popular is Boris Johnson? Well, you've all seen this graph. It shows that Boris Johnson won the most number of votes in the first ballot, 114 in total, and was way in front of anybody else. Jeremy Hunt won the second most with 43, Michael Gove 37, Doominic Raab 27, Sajid 23, Matt Hancock, who's now dropped out, 20, Rory Stewart 19, Leadsom 11, Mark Harper 10, Esther McVeigh 9. We know Boris Johnson would go for a no-deal Brexit if he wanted to, but it's not his primary aim. In other words, he wants to get a deal with the EU, but no deal is still going to be on the table with Boris Johnson as leader. Now, what's likely to happen over the next coming weeks, as people drop out, they will then go on to support the other candidates. For example, you'd expect a hard Brexiteer like Esther McVeigh or Doominic Raab to support somebody who's more in favour of a no deal. As we know, Boris Johnson voted to leave in 2016, he campaigned to leave, and he is more the leave candidate, whereas Jeremy Hunt obviously voted to remain. Of course, Jeremy Hunt wants a similar kind of thing, to renegotiate the backstop and leave the EU with a deal. Michael Gove is even softer on that, saying that he would extend Article 50 beyond October the 31st. So let's just suppose the softer Brexiteers, or the Remainers, all get behind Michael Gove instead of Jeremy Hunt. That would split the vote and mean that the majority still goes towards Boris Johnson. So it's still very likely that Boris Johnson will gain the support of most MPs, and amongst the party members, he's still the most favourable as well. If you look at the gap between the candidate and the person directly below them, you can see that Boris Johnson is miles ahead, 71 seats ahead of everybody else. In second place is Michael Gove, 10 seats ahead, and then third place is Rory Stewart, and then fourth place is Jeremy Hunt, and then Doominic Raab, Sajid Javid, and Matt Hancock, Andrea Leadsom, Mark Harper, and Esther McVeigh only 1 seat ahead of the person directly below them. What this shows is how unpopular Jeremy Hunt is compared to Boris Johnson. You'd expect, if Jeremy Hunt was popular, him to be streaks ahead of Michael Gove. Instead, he's only 6 seats ahead of Michael Gove. Michael Gove is a few more seats ahead of Doominic Raab, proving that Doominic Raab, Sajid Javid and Rory Stewart are in this kind of middle ground of the pack that hasn't dropped out yet. But it's still within this quarter of the graph, whereas Boris Johnson is way out in the fourth quarter. So Boris Johnson's still looking like the next most likely Prime Minister. So then I took a look at historic first ballot votes to see how Boris Johnson has fared historically compared to previous leaders. Now, the light blue on this graph indicates that they were first place in the first ballot and became leader. The dark blue indicates they weren't first place, i.e. second place, in the first ballot, but still became leader. So back in 65, Heath got 150 seats, Thatcher got 130 in 75, then a massive 314 in 1989, and then 204 in 1990. Major got 218 in 1995. Then the Tories went through a bit of a rough patch as Blair got into power and Brown was in power as well. And Haig only got 41 seats, Duncan Smith 39, Cameron 56 on the first ballot. And then, surprisingly, May did actually very well on her first ballot back in 2016, gaining 165 seats. She was actually very popular when she first came into office. Boris Johnson, meanwhile, is better than Thatcher in 75, better than Haig, Duncan Smith, and even David Cameron when he first came into office, but worse than, say, a Thatcher who is already in office and has already proved herself, and Major as well, when he had already been in frontline politics for a while. May had been in frontline politics as a Home Secretary for a while. Boris Johnson, remember, he's only been London Mayor and Foreign Secretary for a bit before he resigned as a result of May's deal, but he made a number of vocal mishaps as a result of being Foreign Secretary. Now, of course, that doesn't quite put into context because over the years, the Tory party has grown and shrunk with elections. So what's a better way of looking at this is through their overall margin as a percentage of the party. So Heath got 50.4% in 65. Thatcher only got 47.1% when she first came to office. But then in the vote in 89, she got a whopping 84% of Tory support in the first ballot, by the way. And then it shrunk to 54.8, and then Major 66.3. Haig got 25. Duncan Smith only got 23.5. David Cameron only got 28.3. As I said, May did very well. She got 50.2%. Boris Johnson, meanwhile, in the first ballot, got 36.4%. So he's done better than David Cameron, William Hague and Ian Duncan Smith, but still worse than May, worse than Ted Heath, worse than Thatcher when she first took office. So according to these numbers, he's a bit lower than, say, a Thatcher when she first takes office, but he's higher than a leader that never became elected like William Hague or Ian Duncan Smith. Michael Howard haven't included in this because he didn't actually go through a ballot voting process like the other candidates on this list. If you look at the gap between the first and the second place, you can see that Heath and Thatcher, when she first took office, only got 5 and 4%. Then Thatcher in 89 again did massively well. Between first and second place was 75.2%. And then she continued that in 1990. Major did alright in 95 with 39.2%. Hague, Duncan Smith and Cameron all came second, so they all got minuses. May got 30.1%, better than Leadsom. And Johnson is on 22.7% ahead of Jeremy Hunt. So he's doing better than Thatcher in 1990 and Edward Heath and the leaders that took office when the party wasn't in power. It seems to me like the MPs of the party don't view him as experienced and competent as, say, Major was in 1995. So he's struggling on that ground, or May even. If we compare Jeremy Hunt compared to other second place margins, you can actually see that Jeremy Hunt is a lot worse than most of the second places in ballots. So Maudling in 65 was 44.6. It's actually gone down throughout time except Mayor. Heath was 43.1. Heseltine was 40.9. John Redwood was 27.1. William Hague was 25. Duncan Smith was 23.5. David Cameron was 28.3. Of course, he went on to become the leader and eventually Prime Minister. Leadsom was 20.1. But Hunt, doing much worse, 13.7, so only slightly better than Sir Anthony Mayer in 1989 when I've shown you Thatcher had that massive majority. So Boris's popularity as well as Thatcher's popularity are these two people's downfall. We look at third places compared to Michael Gove and the other candidates. I've included spoilt and abstained ballots in this because there wasn't always a third place in the leadership election. But you can see that Powell, Fraser got 5.8%. Then all these spoiled and abstains got around 5%. Redwood 16.5%. Ken Clark got 21.6%. Liam Fox got 21.2%. Michael Gove in 2016 got 14.6%. But in 2019, he's only got 11.8%. So he's done much worse than 2016. Much worse than when the Tories were looking for a leader around the early noughties. And actually, if he's doing worse than 2016, and he was third place in 2016, don't forget, then it proves that he's actually going on the downhill with time rather than the uphill. But it could be because of the cocaine scandal. It could just be because there are too many soft Brexiteer Remain candidates and the vote's getting split. And by the second ballot, all that vote will congregate behind one candidate, and that candidate will either be Jeremy Hunt or Michael Gove. But either way, it's going to be split because there's still Michael Gove and Jeremy Hunt who are popular. So I just wanted to compare the other candidates as well. Doominic Raab doing better than the spoiled and abstained ballots, but still worse than Redwood, Clark and Liam Fox in those years. Javid, again, doing similar, and Hancock, even though he's dropped out, doing similar. So they're in a kind of, along with Stewart, in a kind of group of three. Actually, Rory Stewart is just doing only slightly better than the spoiled ballot papers in 1989. I don't know what that says about the 1999 leadership election or this leadership election, but if you look at the people that are below those numbers, they've all dropped out. It looks like Stewart, Javid, Raab, Gove are all in the firing line come the next ballot. And Gove, as I've shown, is on the way down rather than the way up. So if we take a look at the history of the Tory party, the dark blue represents when the party was out of leadership, out of governance. The light blue represents when the party was in governance as Prime Minister of the country. And what I've done is I've taken their percentage when they faced a leadership election versus their number of seats when they faced a general election, and shown it as a percentage of their seats. So, for example, if a leader wins a leadership election with 100% of the seats and they gain 300 seats in a general election, then 300 will show up on this bar graph. Likewise, if they win a leadership election with, say, just 20% of the seats, then only 20% of that will show up on the bar graph. And it gives an idea of the popularity of various leaders throughout time. So back in 1965, Edward Heath was slightly more popular than the leaders of today, actually. And he went in and out of popularity a lot. He was leader from 70 to 74, but by February 74, he had lost an election. And then following a series of elections, there was a leadership election. Thatcher took office with 140 seats in command of. So effectively, you could imagine that if she took a percentage as a leadership election and the party had a various margin as part of a general election, she was in command, direct command of 140 of those seats. But of course, then we had the 79 election. The Tories won that election. She gained command of, say, 160 seats. Then that grew in 1983 for the general election then. And then 87 for the election then. It carried on growing. And then, of course, in 1989, she won that leadership election with almost 90% of the Conservative MPs vote. And then when Major took office, he did a bit worse than Thatcher, but still very well, with the same number of seats. And then, of course, the Tories started to lose seats, so this number goes down a bit. But John Major carried on successfully in office until 1997, when Tony Blair won with a huge majority. So there was a leadership election. William Hague was elected with not very much percent of the overall margin of MPs in the first ballot. The number of seats that the Tories had was also very low. So William Hague only really commanded 41 seats. And then, of course, that grew a bit in 2001. And then Duncan Smith took over with a slightly higher percentage. And then Michael Howard, who faced an election. The Tories were starting to gain back seats by this point as Labour were failing. David Cameron won that leadership contest with a slightly bigger margin. He won that election, gaining seats. He won the 2015 election from a coalition government to a government with a small margin. And of course, when May took office, she won her leadership election by 50.4%. And then she had, a small margin number of seats in Parliament. So she would have had direct command of about 166 seats, should she have kept that support within her party. But instead, she decided to go for a general election. She lost the seats. She went from 330 seats to 317 seats. And because she lost the number of seats in Parliament, she lost out on the percentage of the number of seats that she had command over, losing 6 seats in total. So Boris Johnson, as a percentage of the number of seats the Tories currently have, would command 115 seats. That's about 40%, which is what he won in the first ballot of the leadership election, over the 317 seats that the Tories have in Parliament. So what this tells us is he's doing better than Hague, Duncan Smith, Michael Howard during this period where the Tories weren't in power. He's even doing better than David Cameron during his entire campaign, even when he was in power during the coalition government and during 2 years he spent in the minority Conservative government. But he's worse than we all thought May was going to be. when she took office. He's even worse than May just after the election because of the percentage of the leadership campaign that he won. He might prove to become more popular come the second ballot, and he might, when faced with the general election, be able to win seats. But you can see that this period of the Tory party is much worse than the pre-Thatcher period, and I think that the Tory party are going to struggle to recover from that. It seems like, if they've been gaining since William Hague through to David Cameron, and when May took office, they've been losing again. The trend shows that even though Boris Johnson might be a popular leader, he has a lot of gaining work to do, and he's more likely to lose. But having said that, let's not forget that Thatcher was at a kind of losing point in comparison to, say, Heath when she took office, and Boris is only 50 seats off Thatcher when she first took office. So what it proves is that it really could go either way. He's either Major when he lost office in 97, or he's Thatcher when she took office in 79, or he's Cameron when he won a minority government in 2015. So not great, not terrible. But do you agree with me? Join in the debate below and subscribe.